どうしたの？今日はいつもと違って甘えたさんだね。誰かに何か言われたりしたの？図星？いいよ。今日はたくさん甘やかしてあげる。
So, hey guys, I actually found this background and it's like basically doing what I'm doing right now. So, I thought that was kind of ironic and funny. Um, but I wanted to do another segment on foreshadowing and irony, kind of how those things work, and why they're maybe important. Irony is a thing that an author has to be really careful crafting because it can kind of fall apart or not be good if it is, I guess, like too poorly done. Irony can make us laugh. It can make us like scared. It can make us, spit out our water if it's something that we're just completely not expecting. And if it's really well done, it can be a beautiful thing. In fact, irony is a great source of comedy, right? We set up somebody to expect one thing to happen, and then ultimately, like a completely different thing happens. So I was thinking about great moments of irony, and I used to teach this story by Isaac Asimov called "Rain, Rain, Go Away." And there's this huge irony kind of throughout that you don't really understand until the end, but you're given many, many hints kind of throughout, right? So, spoiler alert, I'll probably destroy this story for you, but you might want to read it at some point because it's kind of a cool story. So, there's this family, and there's this nosy wife, right? And she's constantly watching the neighbors. The neighbors are called the Sakaros, right? Which is kind of a Japanese sounding name. We don't really get to know too much about them, right? But Sakaro also sounds like saccharin, which is kind of something to think about. Basically, these neighbors are, by the end, we're not sure. They may be some kind of like alien or something like that. But what happens is that there's foreshadowing throughout the story that they're afraid essentially of being out while the weather is bad, right? Come the end of the story, which is 6 pages maybe later, it begins to rain, and the family gets hit by this water, and they eventually like melt into a pool of nothing because they're made out of sugar, right? So we have this foreshadowed the entire time. The whole point of the story
どうし
is
た
to
の？
kind of be ironic, and it's accomplished through this sort of like expert at foreshadowing. The foreshadowing is really interesting because it doesn't actually make sense until the end of the story, right? You get all these hints, like the dad carries like a radio so he can constantly listen to newscasts about the weather. The son carries a barometer so that he can measure, the likeliness of it raining. And the mom is constantly, hounding them about, not going out during kind of not prime weather. So I pulled these two quotes here. The first one is, "She's always looking at the sky. I've seen her do it 100 times, and she's never been out when it's at least the least bit cloudy. Once, when the boy was out playing, she called him in. She called to him to come in, shouting that it was going to rain." Right. The other one here, "Their faces blurred." This is from the end. Their faces blurred as the rain hit, blurred and shrank and ran together, all three shriveling, collapsing within their clothes, which shrank down to three sticky, wet heaps. And while the Wright sat there transfixed with horror, Lillian found herself unable to stop the completion of her remark, made of sugar and afraid they would melt. Okay, so if I'm pulling these quotes, this is obviously dialogue. So just in case you didn't know, we have to change that to a single mark to indicate dialogue, right? And we have to have a quotation mark on the outside of that to show that we are quoting that thing, right? This last one, the dialogue starts like right here, so we have to have a single mark here, and then double for the quote, and then a quote right here. Okay. So these are the two things that I kind of want to work with. Again, I want to talk about foreshadowing and irony, and so I selected kind of moments where I got to see that. All right. So down below, I might kind of start my paragraph. If I haven't already mentioned in my introduction the title and the author, I might start with something like this. So let me make this large and bold so that we can all see what I go with. 16 probably. Bold, Times New Roman. There we go. All right. So I might start with in the short story, rain, go away. Did I spell rain wrong? That's weird. Rain, Go Away by Isaac Asimov. Whoops, no E. The author writes, and then our first quote, right? We could do it that way. We could also do this. We could say the author describes a suburban, it feels like a suburban family, who is discussing their neighbors' peculiar actions. Okay, because the wife is always talking about how weird they are. So last time I got into the quote and then I explained the quote after, like giving context so my audience really understood what was going on. You can also lead into the quote with some sort of context and then drop the quote saying something like Asimov writes, comma, quotation mark. Oh, I already have that there though, so boom. Okay. She's always looking at the sky. I've seen her do it 100 times. Now this quote kind of makes a little more sense because we have some context around it. This is the weird stuff that she's basically doing, right? So we can get immediately into our sort of discussion of foreshadowing because we've already framed this quote to the point where the audience would understand why it's here, right? So when we talk about foreshadowing, if we look up, foreshadowing, this is when the author gives a hint or clue about what is going to happen in the future of the story, all right? We could say, during this discussion between the husband and wife, the audience might expect that this is just a funny moment in the story, and the wife is actually just too nosy and a busybody. Okay. That's kind of like what we get at first because we don't know the characters. This happens basically on the first page. So let's see. My quote actually ends here. I know for a fact that it's on the first page, so I'm going to put that like that. Okay, just so I'm correct. Now I want to talk about the foreshadowing here. However, you know, I'm going to do my transition, kind of a but, right? However, what the audience may not understand is that this is subtle foreshadowing that the family is actually deathly afraid of coming into contact with water. Okay. Now, if I wanted to talk about multiple elements of foreshadowing, I could actually drop them right here, or I could find more quotes for them if I wanted. I could say something like this. This is further illustrated by when the Sakaro family, the Sakaro mother, is talking with the husband's wife. I forget their name, their like family name. Maybe it says it at the beginning there. George, what's the wife's name? Lillian, right? Okay. So let's minimize that. With Lillian, this is further illustrated by when the Sakaro mother is talking with Lillian and very carefully offers offers her a glass of water, not even spilling a drop. Okay, so I just kind of like add a little bit of extra weight to what I'm saying about this hint, right? Ultimately, in the end of the story, or actually in the resolution or denouement of the story, the Wright family, I think it was Wright, the Wright family discovers, comma, to their horror, because I know the author uses that word horror, right? That the family is actually made of sugar. Okay. Asimov writes, comma, quotation mark, and then we'll pick up our second quote here. These quotes look really giant because of the size of the font, but they're not actually super huge. I think this is like 2 sentences. Oh, undo button. There we go. This, all right. This ending to the story is ironic because it completely defies the audience's expectations for the family. In fact, the audience probably doesn't expect that there is really any sci-fi element to the story unless they have read Asimov before. So I actually take it outside of this short story and I talk about Asimov's career because he's kind of like a sci-fi writer. So I don't need that second quotation mark there. That just like shot out at my eyes and I saw it. You know, if you know that Asimov is who he is, you're going to know that he writes sort of sci-fi that has, you know, twist endings and things like that. All right. So when we go through here, we have our quote that introduces our sort of hint that we're getting, or the foreshadowing, right? We have a quote that we use to talk about the irony that is involved, okay? Now, we're still going to want some sort of element of sauce, right? Now, we don't know if we're writing this paper to specifically discuss irony in literature. We don't know if we're writing this paper to talk about expertly made sci-fi stuff. We don't know if we're writing this paper to talk about Asimov as a writer. Or if we're just doing an analysis of irony and foreshadowing within Isaac Asimov's Rain, Rain, Go Away. Let's assume that we are doing that last one, right? That we're talking about Rain, Rain, Go Away, and we're doing an analysis piece on just foreshadowing and irony, okay? We could say something like this for our sauce, right? We could say this story expertly expertly illustrates the impactful power of irony on an audience. In fact, many who read the story may find themselves laughing by the end of the story because they never would have guessed the twist ending. Thus, Asimov expertly, I don't want to use that word again. Thus, Asimov proves, illustrates, demonstrates his prowess as a manipulator of audiences and his status as a clever writer. Okay. So, not the sauciest of sauce that I've ever written, but good enough. It talks about, larger picture outside of my essay and the author himself, right? Kind of giving shout outs to Asimov for doing what he does, right? So if we were to look at our beginning of our paragraph right here, and I were to bump it down, again, this wouldn't take up a whole page if this were not giant fonts. But we could say, in the short story Rain, Rain, Go Away by Isaac Asimov, the author describes a suburban family who is discussing their neighbor's peculiar actions. Asimov writes, "She's always looking at the sky. I've seen her do it 100 times, and she's never been out when it's the least bit cloudy. Once, when the boy was out playing, she called to him to come in, shouting that it was going to rain. During this discussion between husband and wife, the audience might expect that this is just a funny moment in the story, and the wife is actually just too nosy and busy, a busybody. However, what the audience may not understand is that the subtle foreshadowing that the family is actually subtle foreshadowing. The family is actually deathly afraid of coming into contact with water. Sorry, my allergies are kind of bugging me. This is further illustrated when the Sakaro mother is talking with Lillian and very carefully offers her a glass of water, not even spilling a drop. Ultimately, the denouement of the story, the Wright family discovers to their horror that the family is actually made of sugar. Asimov writes, their faces blurred in the rain. As the rain hit, blurred and shrank, and ran together, all three shriveled, collapsing within their clothes, which sank down into 3 sticky wet heaps. And while the Wrights sat there transfixed with horror, Lillian found herself unable to stop the completion of her remark, made of sugar and afraid they would melt. This ending to the story is ironic because it completely defies the audience's expectations for the family, all right? In fact, the audience probably doesn't expect that there is really any sci-fi element to the story unless they've read Asimov before. The story expertly illustrates the impactful power of irony on the audience. In fact, many who read this story may find themselves laughing by the end of the story because they never would have guessed the twist ending. Thus, Asimov demonstrates his prowess as a manipulator of audiences and his status as a clever writer. Cool. So we go through, we talk about our sort of sauce right here. We talk about our use of irony right here. And we use those words that we're supposed to use, like expectation and outcome, or like reality is another way that I'll talk about outcome a lot of times. So, expectation right here. Where's our quote start? Right here. Okay. So here we give that one piece of evidence that kind of is summarized furthering our evidence up here. So during this discussion, showing that it was going to rain, audience might blah, blah, blah. However, what the audience doesn't understand is that this is subtle foreshadowing. So here's our hint statement, right? This one, foreshadowing and irony are pretty straightforward. As you can see, the ending is so different that the audience, is shocked, essentially. The funny thing is about this story is that there's so much foreshadowing that the audience shouldn't be shocked if they're kind of a clever reader. For example, like, the Sakaro family eats like a ton of sugary stuff. They go to a baseball game, basically, and are invited by the Wright family. But the Sakaro family eats like a ton of sugary stuff and won't drink any water, for example. And they're even wary of like the grease on the hamburger because that could like melt them. And plus, like, the barometer, the newscast, they're constantly checking the weather and stuff like that, right? And so that's what makes Asimov so clever with this story is you get to the end and you're just completely... You're like, we're working up to something, but it's completely not what you expect, right? So I think it really illustrates the irony there. The other thing that I would do is I would just suggest that you guys listen to this song on YouTube. Um, Actually, let me just pause this. This song on YouTube, Ironic by Alanis Morissette, because it's really clever, right? And it may be past your time, so you might not have heard of this song, but it was on the radio like every day when I was growing up. And it's just a very, very clever commentary on what irony is. It also recently got a reboot on Saturday Night Live where they kind of updated it for modern culture right here. So this has a lot of references to current pop culture. No thanks. Oh my god, you're gonna make me watch the whole ad. I hate you so much. Apple Music, get out of here. So sorry, it's the Late Show with James Corden. But you should listen to this. I may play it in class when I teach you guys irony. It's just a very clever rendition of irony. But again, we can use irony to create comedy, and it's oftentimes a big source of comedy, right? Rather than the kind of shock value that Asimov uses it for, right? You might laugh at the end of that story, only because it's so outrageous. But in fact, if you were actually watching that happen, you would be transfixed with horror like the Wright family. So again, I hope these videos are helpful. I hope that this kind of helps you see how to talk about these two, foreshadowing and irony. You can also know that these four basically work together. So foreshadowing happens, which immediately puts us into suspense, right? While we're waiting, we feel something, like some kind of emotion. And if we're wrong about our guesses, we basically get irony, right? So if we were to look at, for example, Rain, Rain, Go Away, the foreshadowing is all over the place, like the quote that we talked about, right? That puts us into suspense because we're waiting to see what's up with the Sakaro family, right? And ultimately, we feel kind of uneasy, especially towards the end. We might feel kind of like, I guess, that this is some sort of whimsical thing and, entertained or find it funny at the beginning. But towards the end, when the Sakaro family is like rushing to the house, trying to get out of the rain, desperately trying to like get their keys, in the door, our feelings or emotions are going to probably change to something more dark, like anxiety or fear, right? But when they turn into sugar, we might be confused, shocked. We might be, feeling some sort of like laughter, because of how outrageous, it is. So if you found this video helpful, if this sort of discussion of foreshadowing and irony really helped open your eyes to what's going on with this, then please, like I said, subscribe so you get notifications anytime I upload something new. If you just really like this video, smash that like button, or not, whatever you want to do. Please comment though if you did or didn't find this, sort of helpful. As always, feel free to reach out to me. You guys who know me have my contact info. And, sometimes I check the comment section, so I might see what you have to say. Again, hopefully this helped you out. All right. See you next time.